Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ramblemancy. We of course, I immediately choke on my own spit as soon as we go live. So, very professional. We know what we're doing here. Hello, everybody, and
Good
welcome to
evening.
Ramblemancy. An inauspicious start to our evening. um, this is now the Lucas chokes stream. Um,
It's
um,
cough ASMR. That's what the next hour and
that's
a
what we
half
are
is
now.
going to
Yeah,
be.
it's coffee. It might as well be because this. Yeah. Hi. um, welcome everybody. We are going to be talking tonight about so many things, but in particular, uh, we are going to be talking about narrative and mechanics in tabletop RPGs, specifically things like dungeon crawls, world building, storytelling. A fourth thing that I forgot. We're going to be talking about all those things. Um, but first, I'm going to go through the list and say hello to everybody. I'm going to say, hi, Geekouts, welcome. Gemini Lightning, it's good to see you. Nico, welcome back, my friend. I saw jolly old Nicholas, welcome, and Bree, of course. Bree, welcome. Um, Bree, lurk to your heart's content. Uh, but I will also take this opportunity, since Bree is present, that to say that tomorrow, right here on this very channel, during a time when I will no longer be stalling because I had lost track of what I was going to say, um, we will be streaming Borderlands 2. We will continue to stream Borderlands 2 with Bree tomorrow, John and I.
Hmm.
And yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific.
Yeah, 6 p.m.
6 p.m.
Pacific.
Pacific. I remember
Uh,
things.
there will
It's.
be Murderbot the musical. There will be explosions, probably caused by and affecting myself.
Mm-hmm.
All of the good usual Saturday evening chaotic
Yeah.
fun that we have come to expect from Borderlands 2 streams. There might be trains. We don't know.
Yeah, exactly. We make it another chance to see me prove that I am psychic about exclusively trains, but only trains in video games. Um,
And don't forget, when in doubt, grenade out.
when in doubt, grenade out. Exactly. Thank you, Freeman. Um, all right. So,
I got you,
um,
Matt. I'm exploding with excitement.
cool. All right. Well, John, all right. That's a much lower number than I would think.
Yeah, we didn't have the command until like I think the second
I mean, even still,
stream, so we have to play a little bit of catch up.
even still, that seems like a low number. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, so tonight we are going to be talking about some narrative and mechanic stuff in tabletop games. So, John, what do you got for us?
It's fascinating that you ask, Lucas, and I
Mm-hmm.
was talking in the pre-show about this, but this is going to be the evening where, for at least part of it, John won't shut up about that paper that he wrote in his undergrad, because interestingly enough, my senior paper in my English major was actually about kind of this, not quite exactly this, but kind of like this. I
Mm-hmm.
essentially was talking about how the mechanics of a game like Dungeons and Dragons, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, um, the game mechanics themselves kind of promote the telling of a certain kind of narrative.
Mm-hmm.
The way that D&D is structured is essentially such that if you play the game rules as written, you're going to wind up accidentally on purpose telling a heroic fantasy story. And
Right.
so that's, I think, what we're here to talk about tonight,
Yeah.
is the way that game mechanics make that kind of stuff
I
happen.
have to interrupt you, John, because I think I just realized, is it possible that your audio is coming in on the wrong mic?
It is very possible. Let me check.
Because it just occurred to me that something was off, but it might just be
Huh.
the positioning of your mic.
Maybe it is. I'll move it just a little bit
Okay. It also might
closer
be
to
my
my face.
headphones. That's entirely possible too.
Okay.
They're a few years old by now, and they're due for a tragic mishap.
The
Um,
two tragic mishap.
this is the second longest a set of headphones of mine have lasted. So, yeah, but
These ones are ancient.
that they are, Freeman. So yeah, no, I think that's interesting because so one of the things over the course of my last few years that I've kind of come to realize, at least with D&D specifically, is that because I'm gonna pick very here for a second on your phrasing of a certain kind of story, because it is a certain kind of story,
Mm-hmm.
especially as I've said many times on this very show, uh, that D&D, by the nature of the very rules, the structure and the design of the rules is not intended as a narrative experience. Like, yeah, it is.
No, very much for like combat oriented, I
Yeah,
believe, in
exactly.
a lot of
Mhm.
ways. You
Um,
have the armor class stats, you have weapon stats,
and not to mention that
hit
like
points.
90% of the rules are exclusively about combat.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
but also, yes,
most.
Karaoke Night 69, welcome. We are talking
Hey.
about narrative and design in tabletop RPGs, narrative and mechanics in tabletop RPGs. Uh, yeah, that's what we're talking about right
Yeah.
now.
So I'm sorry. And then what was the? You said in particular that D&D is very combat focused.
Yeah, that it's like the way that it's, and this is actually pretty specifically what tonight's topic is about. That literally the design of D&D influences the types of games that you have. And it's not that it necessarily that it dictates that you have that type of game, because you can obviously not do that. But sooner or later in D&D, you are going to have to either homebrew, or in order to like find your way out of combat, or you are going to have combat, right? Like, it's because like almost everything that is interesting about your characters, aside from like backstory type things, is combat focused.
Yeah, like if we measure this in terms of the dice that you get to roll for out of combat encounters, you roll this die, and this is the only die that you roll in
Mm-hmm.
Dungeons and Dragons. And then during combat encounters, any one of these,
Hmm.
sometimes several of them at once. Um, TTRPG is bad for storytelling, amazing for story making. Now that's an interesting comment,
Huh.
actually. I
Mm-hmm.
think by Derpando and one that I think is kind of apt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And I think the medium as a whole, it's probably a good idea to get this disambiguation out of the way pretty early
Mhm.
on, which is that if you're in tabletop RPGs for telling a story, you may I direct you instead to writing a book. Like what Ray was saying last time we were talking about this, and
Hmm.
um, story making, yes, is a good way of saying it. But I think for the purposes of tonight, when we refer to storytelling, we'll basically it'll be understood for the purposes of tonight that we're talking about like collective storytelling. So like everybody contributing, making cool stuff happen story wise, narratively, narrative beats and things like that. So,
Hmm.
but yes, it is an excellent point, and I think it's an important distinction to bring up right now, because I think everything that we have to say about storytelling is probably going to be referring to what Nico is talking about, which is that story making type thing. Um, so yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So good on you for bringing that up early.
Yeah. And I think one of the I mentioned earlier that you kind of accidentally on purpose wind up telling heroic fantasy, and I oftentimes use the Odyssey like as my
Mm,
example here in
yeah.
terms of stuff like that. And there's a lot of different ways that Odysseus is successful in the Odyssey. Most of the times it's because Odysseus is incredibly brainy and very charismatic, but sometimes it's because Odysseus is really good at fighting. And a lot of, I feel like, the fantasy hero's journey in particular, um, a lot of the way that shapes up is like the hero needs to go do this thing, but they're not nearly strong enough to do it yet. So they have to like do some stuff to get stronger. And most often that's like killing stuff. And guess what? D&D's very good at killing stuff, and it rewards you
I mean, all you have to
for
do
doing it.
all you have to do is
Hmm.
look at, like, you don't even have to look at the mechanics of like your character. I mean, look, all you have to do is look at advancement rules as written.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Like there is really no actual like recorded uh, concrete way of of advancing rules as written, um, besides killing stuff. There's a little paragraph thrown in somewhere that's like, hey, you can assign XP values to other actions. but that's up to you, and it's like not part of the game.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like you can do this if you want to.
And same thing with like milestone leveling and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
It's all included as like optional, but is not the default of the game. It is not the most designed part of the game. The most designed part of the game is absolutely combat, and that's that's obviously due to its origins in like the tabletop wargaming tradition. You
Yeah.
know, like it's definitely from that, obviously. So it's not that like this is by no means saying that it's bad for these reasons. It's just it's not exactly the most conducive for like any kind of narrative game per se.
Right.
Or rather,
So,
let's put it this way: you can have a narrative game in D&D, but the system doesn't help you do it. Is what
mhm.
I'm saying. Like you can do it, but the system itself has nothing to support that. You pretty much are as a GM and the players, you pretty much are supporting that aspect of the game all on your own with no mechanics involved or whatsoever. So,
Right.
yeah.
So I suppose maybe a good question is there's not like it's not a very heavily supported side of the game, but how does D&D like how do D&D mechanics how do they do that? How do they help you make a story?
Hmm.
Um
And that can be anything from like dungeon design to like pieces of world building to or even just to like your own character, right?
yeah. I think that one of the things that 5e in particular does and that I didn't see in older editions is including backgrounds as part of the character creation.
Oh yeah,
I
I'd
think
forgotten about that.
yeah, but I think that they are unfortunately such a they don't affect very much. Like they
Hmm.
might give you a few extra proficiencies and like maybe a few interesting starting items, but like basically once you get past like 5th to 8th level, your background basically stops mattering.
Hmm.
Cuz I mean other than like the proficiencies, but like the additional items that you start with at the beginning, it like they stop mattering because either you've run through them all or they are sort of obsolete at that point because you found better stuff or bought better stuff. Um, but yes, I will agree with Geek Outs. This is a really excellent point that for new role players, the personality traits, flaws, etc., those things are very useful for new players because it gives them an idea of like, oh, this is something I should be thinking about. And that at the very least is something that I can say that does help kind of a more narrative style of game, especially with new players, because it puts them in the mindset of like, I mean, basically, like a game's mechanics is going to dictate naturally what people are going to focus on, what the players are going to focus on. It's going like whatever the game design focuses on is an indicator, serves as an indicator for the players as to for what they should be looking at, you know. And that's
Yeah.
not like it's not saying that this is it's not prescriptive per se, because I wouldn't go so far as to say that like any game specifically tells you how to play it, right? How you're
Hmm.
supposed to play it, but it it basically like it creates a path of least resistance kind of in the direction that the game was sort of like I guess intended.
Hmm.
And so in that way, having something like that, like the traits, like the bonds and those sorts of things, yes, a roadmap, exactly, Matt. Having those bonds, the bonds, flaws, those sorts of things, having those present gives at least some indication that to players that, oh, this is an important part of this, right?
Hmm.
And that's why I know. Okay, it didn't take us long to get here, but alignment. I'm going to talk about alignment for a little while.
Oh boy.
So alignment, I think, is an interesting thing. It's very controversial. A lot of people have a lot of feelings about it. Personally, I agree with a lot of the pushback against the alignment system, but there's one thing that I think it is very useful for. It is useful as a tool, not as a prescriptive measure, but as a tool for use in thinking about your character's personality, basically. That's
Hmm.
what I think it is. It's useful as a guide rather than as a prescriptive measure. It's like here's a thing. I want you to like this is what these different alignments mean. Now, what do you think your like within these alignments, what does your character kind of look like or behave like, or what do they believe, that kind of thing. I think that's useful as a tool, not as. I think it's. Let's put it this way. I'm glad it was taken out as a relevant gameplay mechanic. It has no mechanics implications, which I'm glad about.
Yeah.
But I don't agree with getting rid of it altogether, and that's yeah.
With the exception of somebody casting detect or protection from good or good/evil on themselves. That's like I think the only point at which.
Nope, not even that.
Oh really?
Because if you look at the spells, it doesn't actually detect anything remotely to do with alignments. It detects creature types.
Oh, huh.
Interesting, because I think the origin of character alignment was really more as a classification for monsters and for NPCs, so that you could be like, so that characters could like, I ping, harkening back to a phrase I heard so many times playing 3.5 with a paladin in the party, I ping detect evil. Like,
Yeah.
So you could decide, is this a dragon in human form, or is this guy just like kind of creepy?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I know where it comes from, and it comes from this idea that good and evil are cosmic forces that exist objectively, right? And that serves a sort of simplistic take on gameplay, right? Good is good, evil is evil, and I mean, basically anybody can span the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And that is, and basically like your decisions are, it's not just your character that is being prescribed by that system, it's also your decisions that are being prescribed by that system. Because good, like if good and evil are objective forces that exist in the universe, then that means that there are objectively good and objectively evil choices. This has turned into philosophancy.
Philosophancy. Coming
That's
soon
one.
to a Rule of Lore evening near you.
I'm writing that down. I like that. I was going to say something. It just left. Wow.
Yeah, I was just gonna say Freeman thoughts.
Not on this. Not on the. Not necessarily on the alignments. Although when it was first brought up in our home game, it worked for me at that time as a guide. Be like, okay, so I'm playing a barbarian, chaotic neutral, so it helped for a guide. Definitely, definitely a guide. And what I was going to say was something about what we were talking about right before the alignments. About definitely you bring a lot to the game, because the book has its structures and it has all these mechanics in it, but we really have to bring like the the meat of it. I think maybe not the meat of it, but the soul of it. Then is probably a better way. That's what we do. That's where the beautiful storytelling and the character moments, the real human or creature, whatever moments. That's where it happens. That's the
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Much of the next arc of my particular game was essentially inspired, and this is something that I think I've said this before about Dungeons and Dragons and the DM's guide, and like some things, some aspects of creating your character, but the DM's guide contains actually what's a lot of little what amount to like little writing prompts and like decent writing advice. So the next arc of a game that I'm running is very likely going to be inspired by this 20-30 page Silmarillion-esque document that one of my players has written, because he made a specific kind of sorcerer, and he's like, this seems like kind of an uncommon combination of things. I want to figure out what this is all about. And now there's a little chunk of my world that exists because he was curious about like a bunch of Ozmar dragonborn sorcerers.
Yeah, and I want to point out something that Geek Out said a second ago, because I fully agree with this, and Freeman can even tell you I've brought this up in our own home game. This is kind of canon in our own home game, but Geek Out says, personally, the battle between chaos and order is more interesting, and I absolutely agree. And those in my homebrew setting are the only actual objective cosmic forces that exist. Now the exception for me, because I think it's very interesting to me, the exception are deities and deity-like entities, right? Because I find the idea fascinating that the that these all-powerful entities are limited in a way that mortals aren't,
Mhm.
right?
Hmm.
They're limited by objective good, objective evil, right? They are limited by those things, but they exist only for those types of beings. But for mortal beings, the only ones that matter are chaos and order. And I think that's an interesting concept. So I don't know. I think it's yeah, but I agree that chaos and order makes sense as far as like objective cosmic forces. Um, but I also want to point out um, what karaoke
Karaoke.
night. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say karaoke night's talking about something interesting too, in terms of like you're right, and I feel kind of the same way about imposing alignment on my characters because I feel like every single character I'm like, well, they're like chaotic good, I suppose, and then I read the description for chaotic good, and then the description for neutral good, and then the description for lawful good, and I'm like, I hate all of these,
Mm-hmm.
because they're all like very polarized, like, and there's a lot of shades in between those things, and like D&D in terms of the mechanics that it supplies you with alignment and the descriptions of it and your bonds flaws and like those little snippets from your background like almost give you something to go on, but they don't quite tell you or give you any like mechanical benefits for doing so or any like mechanical inclination to like play your character or to be informed about playing your character a certain way. So yeah, I feel you on that, like neutral good, but what what does that mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say that it's useful as a tool for thinking about your character's personality. That's
Hmm.
how I have always encouraged alignment in my games to be used, is as a tool to figure out what your character is like. Um, it's basically like a measuring stick, basically, where that you can set next to your character and go, okay, they fall somewhere in here. And then from there, it's up to you to determine what that looks like for your character. That's how I always treat
Hmm.
my characters.
Hmm.
My PCs. That's how I treat them. Is I'll sort of arbitrarily, based on the idea that I have in my mind of this character, I'll pick a uh, an alignment and then sort of figure out what that looks like, how that those aspects manifest in them. But I will agree that if you adhere to a level of rigidity with alignments, then you stop having characters and instead you have alignments.
Hmm.
In place of characters, you have alignments, and you're no longer playing characters; you're playing alignments, and that's
I was gonna say you go from having a character to having a caricature.
mm-hmm,
Just
Yeah.
yeah. But
punchy little
also,
phrase, but
I will say, welcome, Heart of Handprints. Please, we're happy to have you here. Stay as long
Hi.
as you want, or as short a time as you want. We're just having a good time talking about games.
Gemini lightning. Yeah, I know. Like inflict wounds not being a spell that is
Right?
tied to evil
Yeah.
characters only anymore is
See, now
so
that's a
nice.
thing. See, again, like this is why I feel like the idea of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater is sort of it's problematic for me because there are things I think that alignment does that are good, like that, like having spells tied to alignments is interesting because
Mhm.
it has the potential for prompting character moments and like decisions so that like doing something like Gemini Lightning says like inflict wounds carries more weight behind it because it's if you think
Mhm.
about it, it's a pretty fucked up thing that you're doing when you're
Yeah.
casting inflict wounds. You're not hitting them with a sword, you're not burning them with magical fire. You are just ripping them apart with magic.
Yeah, it's
That's pretty
or like
fucked up.
can you imagine a good character casting Finger of Death, right?
Mhm.
Which is like inflict wounds, but way more metal, and at a much higher level.
Mhm.
Because I think the description for Finger of Death is basically you try and turn them inside out with magic or something like that. Like
Something
that's
like that. I
that's
don't know. But and like I
Oh.
think I agree with Gemini Lightning that I think it's good that they're no longer restricted by alignment. But I think that there should still be something like carrying weight right? There should still be some like weight carried behind these really fucked up things. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that alignment is like the way to do it by like restricting or anything like that. But just having imposing penalties, not necessarily like similar to what like the madness table,
Hmm.
the madness tables, something like that for for spells that they carry weight, right? And then it would be like GM's discretion how like when they apply them, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that could be interesting. Um, Dread Pirate Robert, welcome. Says, there is rigidity in alignments, though. If you think of your alignment as a code you live by, that can be true. But consider this: consider that you are living by your character is living by a code, and that code is not necessarily the alignment, right? Like the code is what matters, not that it is lawful neutral. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So like yes, I agree with you in principle. I agree with you in principle, but I don't know that they have to be that the code is like necessarily synonymous with alignment. They can be related, but I don't know that they are. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Part of me almost wants like some kind of system where doing seriously evil shit can mechanically push you in the directions of different alignments. But like D&D is crunchy enough as it is.
Right.
And
Very
so
crunchy.
like if you start the problem with a game like 5e that's already as complicated as it is if you start like putting in mechanics like that, you start trending in the direction of the Pathfinder 2 book, which I think is about this thick.
I don't know if it's that thick, but it is a lot. Pathfinder
If you
has
notice,
historically been
It's quite
very
it's much.
yeah.
It's much in its muchness.
Although that's in part because they have like a core rule book rather than a player's book and a GM's book and they have
That's
like
true.
the core rule book. So
if we look at one of our favorite handbooks, the Cipher Handbook, it's very thick, but that's because it contains more than just like the player's handbook.
exactly, yeah. Oh gosh, let's see. Dread Pirate Robert says if a person regularly goes outside their alignment, then they have to consider an alignment change. Maybe. I think that depends on the type of game that you're playing. And again, like because I sort of think that I think you're again, I agree with you in principle. Like I agree that that is true. However, I I'm wondering how much more interesting that would be done through like shown through like the characters' attitudes and intentions and actions rather than like some letters on a page. Does that make sense? Where, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and I kind of agree, but that like their actions should dictate like actions and choices dictate who you are as a person, and vice versa. But yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I'm saying is that it's true is that it's all in how it's RP'd exactly, and I think that's the kind of thing going back to last week's topic about conversation like taking care of each other at the table and table etiquette. That's one of those things that I think is an interesting thing to have a conversation as a GM having a conversation with your player about. Be like, okay, so I noticed that you're doing all of these, making all these choices. So I'm wondering do you want to explore that sort of like your character going down like a darker path? Let's talk about how that could potentially happen. And I think that because that storyline, what you're talking about, Dread Pirate, is basically that's a staple in so much fantasy and fiction. That staple of like the good person who like flirts with darkness, right? Because of either some trauma that they endured or because of like circumstances. That is like a staple. So I think that's an important thing to explore. But I don't know that just because the on the other hand, and this is from my experience, I've had characters where I've like players at the table, or I've imposed an alignment change based on their choices, and they accepted it, said, "Yeah, that makes sense," but then didn't play the new alignment. Does that make they kept playing the character as consistent to the character, but not necessarily consistent to like an alignment change. So mostly I think my argument here is more based on like how effective just changing the letters on the character sheet actually is in making anything different, I guess.
Hmm.
I don't know. I see it more. What I guess when I say earlier is like a a tool for figuring out who your character is. As I think it is most useful at character creation, and then from there, your character is free to change. In fact, they should,
Hmm.
Hmm.
because you can't tell me if going from barely more than a farmer to being this epic hero who's clearing out dungeons full of demons and shit, that doesn't change a person. You can't tell me that. So like I think that characters should change regardless of whether it's alignment based or not. They should change. So yeah, I don't know. And the interesting thing is that this whole conversation that we're having about alignment actually just serves to go back to our original point, which is that D&D inherently in its design doesn't really offer a lot of, because I think doesn't really offer a lot of like narrative support, because this is all stuff that could have been I even see, like Dread Pirate Robert says, this is why I like to add flaws that cause moral dilemmas with their alignment. Like that kind of thing is what fleshes stuff out, is like fleshes out narrative stuff and prompts narrative things, but it's not really imposed, or even not imposed, that's the wrong word, but it's not really, and that kind of thing isn't really supported by the rules of D&D. Like, you can add it in there, absolutely, you can do that if you want to, but you could just as easily play the game D&D without ever once thinking about your character's decisions and why they are making them. Like, you could absolutely do that.
Right. And this is to turn the conversation to another system that I know that we're all very fond of here. This is one of the reasons that I really enjoy Cypher for very narrative focused games. Um, and to kind of jump off of what Gemini Lightning is saying, like there's no alignment in a system like Cypher,
Mm-hmm.
but what you do have a lot of times at character creation, almost every single character descriptor or focus or something has a certain set of benefits, but it also tends to carry with it one or more inabilities, like things that your character like can't do or is bad at. And those inabilities tend to be more than like, you know, a -2 to charisma or a -2 to strength or something like that, which again like offers you role-playing opportunities, but it doesn't really like mechanically do a whole lot
Mm-hmm.
to you apart from making you like really bad at athletics checks or really bad at persuasion checks. um Whereas like the narrative opportunities of something like a character of mine having an inability in willpower and patience means that like I'm playing somebody who's very impulsive, and so that informs first of all my role play of them, the decisions that I make in terms of like, are they going to sit around and wait for the correct thing to do, or are they going to do right now what they can do in front of them. But at the same time, like if I have to, if the GM presents me with an intrusion or like a role that requires my character to be patient, all of a sudden like there is a mechanical thing here that influences both the gameplay and the narrative.
Yeah. Um. Uh. Sorry, I was gonna go.
Matt, I'm not trying to slow down me. What?
Um. I will agree with another thing that Kiko had said, which is adventurers need therapy. Listen, if you are if
Hmm.
you live in a D&D setting and you go into a line of work as a therapist, you will probably make bank. Actually, that's not true. You'd have to convince adventurers to go to begin with. So,
Mhm. And that would be a nightmare. Listen, I killed a dragon last week, and so like I think that I can confront my own
listen,
personal demons.
I
I've
dealt
killed literal demons.
I've already dealt with my issues. Okay, I killed like six behir last week. Okay, I'm fine.
Didn't you like stab your friend through the gut while you were mind controlled by one of them? Yeah, but they were fine.
Oh god, it just makes me think of that meme. It's like, I have dealt with my issues. You haven't dealt with shit. I have dealt with them.
Yeah.
Nico says, I think most RPGs uh, don't give you enough rules that allow players to build their character outside of combat and exploration. Give me more downtime activity rules. Yeah, exactly. But and this is what I'm like not to. I know we were trying to get away from from the D&D conversation, but I
Mhm.
just want to basically put into words, summarize everything that I was trying to say before, which is essentially that everything that isn't combat in D&D, whether there are mechanics for it or not, feels grafted on,
Hmm.
and largely like you can and probably should ignore them because they just feel like they are getting in the way of what the system wants you to do, essentially. So that's basically the what I was trying to say, and I think that it, like Nico's point, makes me think of the like the expanded downtime activities in Xanathar's, right? They're there,
Mhm.
sure, but like how many people actually ever use them? And like I'm not using that as a gauge for how useful they are, because obviously they are going to be more useful in somebody's game than in somebody else's, right? But
Mhm.
if they were somehow brought into the system as something that didn't feel just awkwardly tacked on, then I think that they would, like, more people would use them, and they would be, if it was clearer that it was part of the game and not just this like side thing that, like, if you want to, I guess it's there. But if it was, I don't know. That's kind of a thought that I.
Now, to confirm that Dread is the system that I think it is, Dread is the one in which you play with a Jenga tower,
That is
right?
correct.
And
Yeah.
you have to every time you do something, you have to pull something out of the tower and put it on top, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um. Okay. I want to see what Gemini is saying about that. Let's. The setup is all storyline. The only mechanic is make a pull. You tell a story knowing that in the end you die. It's genius. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. Let's talk about Dread because I think it's fascinating. I've never played it myself, but
Mhm.
I've witnessed it being played both in like the famous example the the Geek and Sundry show and Alpha show Dread, and Sagas of Sundry. Is that what the name of it is? I
I
know.
think
I
so.
feel like
Think
it is,
so.
but for some reason I'm saying it out loud and it sounds wrong. But
Yeah, it's Sagas of Sundry.
okay, good.
Gemini Lightning's got you in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you. Um, it just sounded wrong when I started saying it out loud. It's just anyway. But yeah, that's an interesting one because it is brilliant in that way that it is all set up, and but on top of it, the mechanic is one that is stressful, and
Hmm.
it is essentially a stress mechanic. That is what it is. It is a stress mechanic that is built into the game, but that plays not only on like the stress of your character in the game, but also you, the player's stress, right? And it is representative of like yeah, it's great. That's all I have to say about
It's
that because my brain broke just a second ago.
Oh.
Did you have a thought, Freeman?
No, I haven't watched enough of it, and I don't know enough
Mhm.
about it. I do know that I want that Jenga tower, though.
Yeah,
Mhm.
well, it's just like it's cool because it's like a physically imminent thing. Like it's not just a game mechanic. There's this thing that me, John, or you, Lucas, or you, Freeman, has to do that
Mhm.
directly affects the
Yeah.
immediate outcome of the game.
Yeah.
It's so
Um,
brilliant because, like, that game can be stressful, just Jenga by itself, not without the other parts.
right.
It can be pretty stressful. Now, make the stakes even higher, and you have this beautiful madness.
Mhm.
I agree. Man, at some point we're gonna have to play that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh
Like
gosh.
sometime when we can have a bunch of people in the same room again. Oh my
I
Yeah,
god.
wonder if there's a
that would
way
be
to
amazing.
figure out, like, if we could figure out to play it remotely. That would be interesting.
We'd all have
Everybody
to
with their
get
oh my god, everybody with
we'd
their
all have to
own.
get we'd all have to get them.
Actually, I can think of a way. This is a thing we're gonna have to talk about, but I think we could do it. Anyway, that's not important right now. Um, I just sorry, I got very excited. I think we could do it. Anyway,
Hmm.
okay. But yeah, no, like the setup is, I think, really important. Like what Gemini is saying, like that being, and the brilliant thing, and this is one of the things that I thought was brilliant about Sagas of Sundry and the way that they did it. Dread in particular. Madness was very good story wise, but Dread was interesting to me in that they had a couple of moments where Ivan, the game master, Ivan Van Norman, basically said, "Okay, you're trying to do this thing. Now you can either make a pull, or you can do this other thing that is representative of the, like, I think at one point somebody has to, like, is trying to hold a door shut, in like this very intense high stakes situation, and
Hmm.
while like everybody else is trying to pile stuff against the door to keep whatever is chasing them out, and Ivan basically says that you can either make a pull you or or you can hold up these two buckets for a certain amount of time while your friends move all those cinder blocks from over there to over there, right? And like that was, I think, really super cool. It was one of those like innovative things that I thought was excellent, because I'm all about immersion in games. I love that kind of stuff. So
Hmm.
the more you can bring to it was just, yeah. Oh, that's right. I forgot about that, Gemini. Matt Mercer had to actually shoot arrows, which was
Oh
cool.
my god.
Yeah. It was like you can make a pull or you can, yeah.
Huh.
Also,
Techman,
hello and
welcome.
welcome, Techman.
Yeah, never played the 10 candle system, but is it less stressful than Dread? I honestly know zero about that system. If anybody else has an answer, feel free to answer their question, because I truly do not know.
Huh.
Yeah,
Um,
what's the?
I've never heard of it.
I'm gonna very quickly
like I
look it
know
up
about
because
10 candles, but I don't think I've never played it or seen it played, so I know nothing about it.
Is it with actual candles? That's what I want to know. That'd be
Candle sets
cool.
the premise that you are going to die. Your character is going to die. Okay, interesting. I'm with you so far.
Huh.
it is played by the light of 10 tea light candles, which provide the atmosphere and act as a countdown timer for the game. They allow you to literally burn your character sheet away as you play.
Oh god.
It's described as a tragic horror game rather than survival horror because
Ooh.
in 10
Oh my
candles, there
gosh.
are no survivors. In the final scene of the game, when only one candle remains, all of the characters will die.
Ooh.
Oh god.
It's not about winning or beating the monsters. Instead, it's about what happens in the dark and about those who try to survive within it. It is a game about being pushed to the brink of madness and despair, searching for hope in a hopeless world and trying to do something meaningful with your final few
Oh
hours.
man.
That's the description on their website. That's
So
really
a
metal.
really light, fun party game is what I'm hearing. Is
Yeah,
what I'm
exactly.
understanding. Yeah, yeah.
Pretty topical, you know?
Yeah, towards the end of October, perhaps.
Uh huh. Yeah. Gosh, that's
Can you imagine, though, like sitting in a room by only the light of these 10 candles and then, like, you know, just like the mood that sets right off the bat. And somebody in chat earlier said that like dread, I think it was Derpanduin said that dread hinges on the storyteller's ability to set the mood.
right. Yeah.
And a game like 10 candles, it sounds like exactly does that just by nature of the way that you prep the game, which is lighting 10 candles and turning off all the lights and then
Yeah.
one by one snuffing them out.
Yeah. That's pretty intense. Huh. I will admit that I am curious.
I am too.
Like I know that at least Lucas you have, but Freeman, have you seen that PDF? I think I've mentioned it before, called The Trajectory of Horror.
Mm-mm. I don't think so.
It's about running horror games in your tabletop games, and it's kind of system agnostic. It just talks about like the
Oh, yeah.
four like intensities of
Is it
fear.
about
Like
games,
how to
or
make it.
or does it talk about writing? Is it about writing
It's
primarily?
I think it's about games.
Okay, I couldn't.
Huh.
It's been a long time
But
since I read it, so
it's kind of equally applicable. Like the
right.
way that they wrote
Yeah.
it is more or less like this is writing advice, but also like it's kind of directed at game runners.
Oh,
Mhm.
like how you set the mood and how you lead the players and down a spooky pathway, sort of.
Exactly, and like the
That's
very
nice.
yeah, and it talks about like
That's
oh, go ahead.
no. I was just gonna say that's perfect. Like that's needed, because and then also to have your players understand what they're getting into as well. I think that's an important thing. Um, be like, all right, you guys want to do something spooky? Because that's what I've got.
Yeah, and the trajectory of horror talks about like the different intensities of fear. So you have
Hmm.
unease, um, dread, terror, and horror.
Hmm.
I think in that order, with horror being the most intense, like visceral, and then unease being, of course, the lowest. And like with something like dread, you're kind of always at this unease level, but you never really sink below that because there's this constant like foreboding. You're like, I'm gonna have to pull soon, or like with 10 candles, like anytime that you're putting like that, you have to put one of those candles out, like you already kind of jump from like baseline from unease straight to dread, where you're like, oh no,
Hmm.
like what's gonna happen when I put this candle up, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing that. So, I know this isn't really what we're talking about, but it is related. So I'm gonna keep talking about this. But there's the movie The Descent, right? is
Mhm.
uh one of the reasons why this movie was it could have been a movie that I really like. I'm not always a fan of the horror genre, but I often am depending on the movie. And the reason that The Descent didn't become that for me, didn't become one of those for me, is because the transition from like that dread place to the what was the last stage, like the bait, like the
Uh, Actually, I think it's horror terror.
okay, yeah,
Um,
yeah, the last stage, the transition is very abrupt, and then they spend way too long in the last stage, and the entire like second half of the movie spends its time there. At which point, like, it just all kind of wears off, and now you're just watching gore, which like
yeah.
a not the biggest fan of in my horror films. I feel like it's pretty
Mhm.
cheap. And B, it is like eventually your mind just sort of like shuts off. You're just kind of like, okay, well, we're here now. This is what this movie is, and then you stop being pulled. So yeah, like exactly, geek out. Score equals snore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Like
good way of putting it for
hmm
sure.
they talk about it in the trajectory of horror. They say that like terror and horror are unsustainable.
hmm
You can jump up to them, but you can't ever stay there for very
Right.
long because like they are either the monster is close or the monster is imminent in front of you doing something.
hmm
And like if you stay there, like you said, it just becomes like kind of vaguely uncomfortable, but not in like an unease or dread sort of
Right.
way. It's just like this is kind of gross.
Which is why I prefer movies that like keep you in the first couple of stages and that never go beyond that. Those are the horror movies that I like. The ones that keep you
Hmm.
in just those like
Hmm.
um oh my god. Okay. Yes. Tucker and Dale versus Evil is an amazing film. It is a treasure. I love that movie so much. Anyway, um
Yeah, we've kind of shifted into cinema a little
a little
bit,
bit, but that yeah.
Ramblemancy.
It's
Um,
related. It's
Ramblemancy.
all
That's
related though.
uh-huh.
yeah.
It's
Well, I mean, we're talking about horror games, and now like we're talking
yeah.
about how that manifests in other media. But Gemini Lightning mentions Alien, and yet
Mhm.
there's so much time that you
Yes.
spend in like dread and unease in that show. And then like when all of the sudden you get your first glimpse, or like there's I think there's a moment, is it in the first Alien where Ripley's like tucked into like some corner, like holding a hand over her mouth, and like the alien's like head
Yeah.
comes around the corner,
God, it's been years since I saw
or it's
that
like
movie, so
face to face with her or something, and that's like terror horror right there. You're just like, oh god, please get it out of her face, you know.
Giga says that's in the third Alien 3.
The third, wow, okay, wow, that's much farther along.
Okay. Yeah, but that's yeah, those I think I've even mentioned it before, but one of my favorite horror it's I hesitate to call it that, but one of my favorite movies in that genre vicinity um is The Orphanage.
Mm.
It is a Spanish film. Um but basically the whole thing is always that like that suspense dread kind of place. There are a couple of moments where it goes into the horror, but then it comes back down. Um, and then yeah, it's a great film. It is very creepy and will leave you pretty uncomfortable at the end, but it also is weirdly wholesome. It's like wholesome in a sad way. Like that's the thing.
Hmm.
You leave the movie sad, not afraid. You leave the movie because it's tragic, but it is yeah, it is a good
um
movie. I like that one a lot.
since we're still to keep even kind of the theme on horror here, and to answer Depanduin's question, I realized, because the game has been sitting on our kitchen table all week, and I've played it a couple of times this week. um I think a good example, and this is not strictly a tabletop RPG, Nico, a good example of using rules to complement a story you're making at the table is Betrayal at House on a Hill.
Hmm.
I don't know how many of you guys have played that,
Oh
but
yeah.
the game itself, you start with just like the hallway of like a haunted mansion essentially, and then you build it out by walking into new rooms and things happen, and eventually one of the players becomes like the betrayer, and then all of the sudden it's that player versus everybody else. And I think that's a super cool like game mechanic that like you can feel the tension ratcheting up the more times you, because the way that you reach that stage where a person becomes the betrayer is by flipping over, I think, haunt cards. And then each time you flip a haunt card over by walking into one of those rooms, you have to roll higher than the number of haunt cards that have been drawn. And so as the game goes on, it gets progressively harder and harder and harder to roll higher than the haunt. And so like all of these things that you've begun to accumulate over the game, it's like, okay, well, if this person hits the haunt and becomes the betrayer, then we are so boned because look at all of this stuff that they have. Like that's its own thing of tension, but also just like knowing that the haunt is coming, that it's inevitable, that eventually you will hit a point where no amount of luck will save you, is so cool. Like I love that so much.
Honestly, I preferred Betrayal at Baldur's Gate,
Me too.
but that's because it has it fixes a lot of the like mechanic issues that the first one has, but you could just as easily take those same things and like pull them back too, like put them in House on the Hill. But yes, those those are fun games to play, especially if you have not played them a lot or at all before.
Yeah, I suspect, and this is because I haven't played it a bunch of times. I suspect that Betrayal at House on a Hill has a bit of a shelf life in terms of like playing the haunts, replaying the haunts and stuff.
Yeah.
So you're like, oh, it's this one.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
There a couple years ago, Freeman and I had a friend who like whenever we were at his house, like more often than not, we would end up pulling out Betrayal at House on the Hill, and after a while, we're like, this one's okay, but like let's just pick a different one and let's do a different one.
We played a lot of that game.
Yeah.
And it's exciting at the time, but it gets a little
Yeah, it's a lot of that stuff. Kind of the thrill of some of it wears off when you know which one it is and you know what has to be done. Because then instead of that panic, like, oh god, we have to do this. You're like, okay, now you have to do this and you have to go here, and if we do this, then you can, and it becomes a little bit more.
It becomes a strategy game instead of a horror game.
Yeah. Yeah, but that goes back to what you were talking about, right? With the state, like the progression of like the horror story, right? It has to be able to maintain that, because if it doesn't, then it ceases to be effective in like the horror genre. Like this is literally like that thing that you brought up. I'm glad you brought it up, John, because that thing is literally exactly what our topic tonight is. It is like mechanics and narrative, kind of, right?
Yeah.
Like mostly the narrative part of it, but it is involved in that relationship,
And honestly, like I will post it in the Ramblemancy channel after this, but like those of you in chat, please do give the Trajectory of Horror a read, because if you can apply the horror metaphor here to just like action and tension in general in stories and in games that you play. It's a good read, and it's very short. It's just a few pages, but
I'll also say for the the GMs out there, I once composed like one of my most successful RPG sessions of all time. Trajectory of Fear, yeah. I based it entirely just following that document as a template. So like, so yeah, it was, and it went over very well. Oh gosh. Looking back, sorry, I'm catching up on chat now. Techman says, I'm thinking of Fiasco. Has rules that are definitely complementary, but is actually the structure or skeleton of what a story will be. Interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. I'm curious about that. If you wouldn't mind saying more. Looking through Gemini Lightning. What did you say? There's a legacy version where you play as a bunch of families. Oh, cool. Ooh. And you rip up cards, add rooms, etc. Cool.
Love that.
That's interesting. I don't think I've seen that one. All right, let's see. I kind of do the same thing sometimes. Karaoke night. I definitely do that sometimes still.
Nico, I'm curious.
Nico has an idea. Cool.
It's a Cohen Brothers flavored group storytelling format. Hold on, look up.
All right. Okay. I'm interested now. That's cool. Probably
That
familiar with
power
4E
says
skill challenges. Yes, I am very familiar. I have unsuccessfully, from my unsuccessful attempts to graft them into 5E.
you'll tell a story about ordinary people with powerful ambition and poor impulse control.
My kind of game.
Yeah, it's I feel like
Perfect.
the trajectory of people's D&D characters and TTRPG characters goes from like playing the powerful like savvy power fantasy character to gradually into the like hot mess like chaotic characters.
Oh,
At least that's my
by
experience.
Heart of
But
Handprints, thank you for being here.
bye.
Have fun over at Wild Cards. Um,
Yes.
yeah, thanks for being here. Um, sorry, John. What were you saying about like?
Oh no, just the I was just commenting on the trajectory of playing D&D characters, because like, your
Mhm.
first few TTRPG characters are like borderline self-insert like power fantasy characters, and like a lot of my characters are still borderline self-insert power fantasies, but instead of being like powerful and savvy, most of the time they're just a train wreck. Like so that with powerful ambition and poor impulse control just like hit very close to home on that spectrum.
Nico says, okay, what if you were to create a system where fights are resolved that way? I see. Okay, I've actually. That's it's interesting that you bring that up because I've actually thought about this before, but not in terms of like a whole system, but of like combat sequences, right? Like the way that I implemented that once in a game was in D&D was basically like it was high level D&D. There were a lot of like hundreds of little like mooks that would individually give the party no problem, but would be absolutely zero fun to like go through real combat to like deal with them all. And so instead we resolved it as sort of like a skill challenge, like and kind of thing. And it was resolved in kind of the way of like in the style of the the suicide mission at the end of Mass Effect 2, kind of that kind of thing. Like the image that I had in my mind was like the end with like Samara holding up like this biotic barrier, and you and everybody inside it like trying to shoot everything that was coming at her, and yeah, that kind of thing, like pushing forward through all these like army of enemies. And anyway, that was
Hmm.
unrelated, but I just wanted to say that that is an interesting thought, and I'd be curious to see what a whole combat system designed that way would be like.
Yeah, actually, I would love, I think, to actually have a system of combat where you beat the combat almost more with your wits than you do with brute
I
force.
mean, theoretically, you could effectively play Cipher combat that way, and Fu can is probably better done that way.
I'm pretty sure we actually, some of the comments that we had just resolved by doing clever shit instead of attacking the dudes that were attacking us
Mm-hmm.
when I was playing, but it's been a while since I've been in that game.
Yeah, yeah. Karaoke Night says rap battles. Hell yeah,
There you
where
go.
combat is resolved by freestyling.
uh,
I would be very bad at that game. Um,
the wizard
You'd almost
versus.
have to versus. Um, you have to there's I think there's a Jackbox game actually that involves rap battling. As you have to play that one to warm up.
nice, nice. um,
Yeah.
mhm,
Geek Guts is correct. The Cipher system has a whole paragraph about how you don't even have to run combat in the Cipher system,
mhm,
and it's also very explicit, the Cipher system, about the fact that combat does not give you experience.
mhm.
Combat doesn't reward XP.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think. See, okay, let's talk about that because I think that's important. That's important to this topic. The idea that combat is part of the game but not rewarded,
Hmm.
and other aspects of the game are rewarded, like exploration, creative problem solving, um, role playing, narrative development, that kind of stuff. Those are the things that are rewarded in Cipher, and I think that's interesting. That's an important thing to point out here because that's literally what we're talking about. We're talking about narrative games and the relationship between mechanics and narrative, basically. That
mhm.
is what we are talking about here. So yeah, John, you look like you were gonna say something about that.
I have some thoughts because it's interesting. Like when you're writing a story, you know, you you're told essentially that at the end of a scene, something should have changed. Something should be different, right? When a character takes an action, something must change as a result of that action, or it probably doesn't belong in your story as
Mm-hmm.
anything more than just like a passing detail or like a transition or something. Um, and so Cypher sort of takes that one extra step and is like, well, D&D, you can fight a bunch of goblins but accomplish something of no narrative purpose. And Cypher says, all right, well, you can fight the goblins if you want, but unless you accomplish something with that, we're not going to reward you for it. So you must progress the narrative of this story that you guys are making in order for the game to reward you. Right? It's almost kind of enforcing that writing maxim of like something must change in order for the story, the scene to progress, the story to progress, the scene to end.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and I think. Okay, so Nico says mechanical rewards can very quickly become poison to your story. I think I agree with you in principle, but what specifically are you thinking of? Because I'm curious, like if you have a specific example in mind. Because a thought that I was just having related to that is the fact that well, I don't know if I agree if I believe what I was just about to say. I was gonna say that like um having the specific impact of the rewards that you get from things in Cipher, the specific impact is essentially your is just is furthering player agency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can use those things to affect the story, like the that you get in Cipher. You can use those things to further affect the story, or you can use it to affect your character.
Mm-hmm.
You can use it to affect actions in moment to moment or more long term things. So I think it's interesting that I wouldn't call, and I'm not saying that Nico was. I'm just this is a totally separate thought that kind of dovetailed with what Nico was saying. Um, but I think it's I don't even know that I would call the XP that you get in Cipher a mechanical reward. Even I'd call it more of like a narrative reward, if anything, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the effect that it has. Right.
Yeah, actually, because like if you consider the uses of XP, right, in terms of affecting the outcome of a role, or even like in many cases creating like short, medium, and long term benefits,
Mm-hmm.
you know, dropping NPCs into the story, like changing something about the narrative to suit your character's purpose, right? Those rewards are designed, as you said, to give players more agency.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a self like the narrative self-perpetuating.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Except it's basically like it's the narrative self-perpetuating, but it's a redistribute the wealth. No, it's basically like giving the players the means to perpetuate the narrative, essentially. Right? It's the DM. It's essentially points that represent the DM handing off the narrative to the players.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I see
It's
what
like narrative vouchers redeem for agency over the story.
it's like the little card that every single coffee house has, that when you come in and get a coffee, they'll like punch a corner out of it, and then when
Mm-hmm.
you get so many punches on it, you get a free coffee.
Exactly.
But with the narrative.
Sure, it's almost exactly nothing like that.
Yeah, fair.
It's kind of nice also to have um other ways of getting rewards or cool stuff when it doesn't, it's not, you're not using violence.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we can solve this, like a Star Trek adventure is a good example of that, I believe. Is that the name of the we
Mm-hmm.
played this? I played a
Yes,
Vulcan, I believe.
absolutely.
It's a very good example of playing a system with another good example, I should say, of playing a system where there's a bit of problem solving to be done, and there's not a huge incentive for combat. There's a huge incentive for problem solving and getting out
Yeah.
of the situation without bloodshed.
Yes. And part of that's what's interesting. That's another great example of, because I do want to get to what Nico is saying, but I want to point out that that is a great example of narrative and mechanics coming together, because there's actually really nothing in the mechanics of Star Trek Adventures that says you should avoid combat and focus on problem solving.
Yeah.
That's purely the Star Trek Starfleet narrative.
Mhm.
That's purely the narrative of the setting. So I think that's a perfect example of this, because that's one where the mechanics don't say don't fight, right? The mechanics don't say that. It's more in line of like if you're playing Starfleet officers, you're probably gonna want to talk before you fight. Like talking is encouraged before you fight, but that's purely setting. So I think that's a really interesting one. But I do want to go into what Nico is saying. I'm thinking of D&D's combat in particular, where the entirety of combat is soaked in meta decisions that very quickly become completely detached from the actual characters that are fighting. Yes. D&D combat so often feels like a separate thing that happens in between the story. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that is correct. I agree with that fully.
And like rules is written, fireballing the headquarters of the town guard does reward you because you do get XP from killing all the guards in there. And you can go loot their weapons and sell them if anyone will buy them to you after you blew up a building in the town. But like in a system like Cypher or Star Trek Adventures, the mechanics side of the game kind of looks at you like, yeah, you sure did do that, didn't you?
Yeah. Oh, okay, hold on. Techman says Feng Shui 1 and 2 treats battles cinematically, where named antagonists are the main threat, while unnamed ones are there to give story flavor and creative character actions. That's so cool. I did not know that. That is really, really cool. I'm going to have to look into that.
Yeah, actually.
That's really interesting.
Got so many notes.
So many notes. I wish I took any.
I wish mine were neater.
Yeah, well.
Mine are exclusively chicken scratch and like a couple of words as I'm thinking about something and then hoping later on that I will remember what it meant.
Yeah. Oh gosh, what was I gonna say? John writes notes in character. Yep. Good. Yes.
Yes. Which character am I writing them in? Who knows? But I'm writing them in character.
God, I had something that I was gonna say about narrative. Oh, Star Trek Adventures. The way that advancement in Star Trek Adventures is very interesting to me, because it is done by milestones, but not like the way that like milestone leveling in D&D. It's done like, I think there's 3 different kinds. There's like the milestone, and then there's the arc milestone, and then there's like one that is specifically for advancing like the ship or something like that. But essentially the advancement, like the most common form of advancement, the milestone, doesn't actually give you anything new. What it does is it allows you the opportunity to switch things around. So like if you find that you're using one thing more than another thing that you have, it gives you the opportunity of like changing that. Like if you have a values are, oh gosh, okay, we're talking about Star Trek Adventures, and we've okay, so Star Trek Adventures, narrative and mechanic. No, this is good. It's just we should have started talking about it earlier. But so values, the system of values is you create a bunch of statements that on the surface are kind of like the traits, bonds, flaws, etc. in D&D.
Right.
But in actuality are like a core mechanic. They're not just sort of like a thing that's there. That they're not just purely role playing. They are literally a thing that allows your character to function. Your values are things that you can call upon to to make make a role easier in some capacity, to like change the difficulty of certain things. It is or you to straight up re-roll sometimes. You can auto crit with it if you have a relevant value to whatever the situation is, and I think that's interesting and cool because it is a narrative mechanic. It is a mechanic It is core to your character, but it forces you to think about your character's decision making in every given moment, because you have to think, does this apply? Does this value that I have apply to this situation? And so it
Hmm.
basically makes your what Nico was talking about in D&D, the meta decision making that has not, that you can so easily become detached. It essentially makes it the same thing as the narrative advantage. It forces you to conflate those two things in your mind, and I think that is amazing. That's what one of the things I love about that system. Um, that it and so the advancement, when you advance, if you made, let's say you had an idea of what your character was going to be like when you made him, and then
Hmm.
when they reach a milestone, and you say, ah, they haven't really been using this, I might actually just change this value to something else, something that is more
Right.
relevant. And that represents the character's growth. It represents like the things that are core to who they are changing over the course of play. And that I think is fascinating. It is amazing. I love that system so much. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like it's like you said, it's a really interesting and like mechanically rich way to demonstrate how a character is changing over the course of time, right? Or demonstrating like how a character is able to shine in certain situations. Like there are things that each one of us is very good at here, that would kind of like amount to the same thing in real life, but you know, it depends on what kind of situation that you're dropped into where that thing is going to be useful.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But I think that's interesting because the other thing, and this is something that we, I guess, probably I've never talked about before, but in Star Trek Adventures, is that even if you don't have a value that is relevant to a situation in which your character is rolling, it still makes you think about your character's decision making in that moment, because because you first try to see, you think to yourself, are any of these relevant, any of these things about my character relevant to what is happening right now? And that, even if the answer is no, it still forces you to think in terms of your character's motivations and the things that they are important to them. Like, yeah, and I think that's brilliant. It is a brilliant mechanic in that way.
Yeah, it's very unlike the kind of set it and forget it system that you have in something like, and again, I promise this isn't just a hate on D&D session. It's just like it's monolithic. We've all played a bunch of it. It's an easy comparison. But like it's very different than the kind of set and forget mechanics of D&D, where it's like, okay, I already know what all my attacks are and exactly how useful they are going to be in what situation, and I like see a monster to hit. And it's not the same as looking over a list of sentences basically and deciding, okay, so what would I do here, as opposed to like which of these options will do the most damage. It's deciding, am I going to fight, am I going to do this thing, am I going to do this thing, am I going to do this thing. You actually wind up weighing your options in a situation instead of just like weighing the illusion of many options, when in fact I boil down to one thing, which is do damage to monster.
And additionally, I will say that I often find myself like, and me as someone who values role playing and narrative over mechanics by far, I I catch myself 99% of the time in combat in D&D, and this kind of goes to what Nico was saying. 99% of the time in combat, I find myself weighing my choices. This is the thing that would be fun, and this is the thing
Mhm.
that would be effective. Notice that
Yeah.
neither one of those options is this is the thing my character would do,
Hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
If I think that, it's usually an afterthought after I've chosen one of the two. This is
Hmm.
the fun thing. This is the effective thing. If I choose the fun thing, I'm like, is that? I guess that's the thing my character would do, right? It's never like, and I know that that's not really saying
Hmm.
much about. That's saying more, maybe more about me as a player, but I think the fact that it's not encouraged in the
Hmm.
system is basically what Nico was talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
It's not encouraged to think that way in the system. In the part of the game that is the most prevalent, which is combat, it
Mm-hmm.
is not encouraged to think in terms of what your character would do. Um,
Freeman, did you have a thought?
Not really. I was just gonna say, like, being a barbarian, it's a lot easier to think about those things because, for me at least, barbarian has a very clear path. What would my character do in this moment? Well, he's raging.
My
He's
character
not
would fuck
thinking
shit up.
straight.
That's what he would
Whatever.
do.
Yeah, he's gonna. Yeah, pretty much.
Hmm.
Not much of a thought, just kind of a comment on that. That's for
Yeah.
my personal, for that very particular character as well, though. So
Yeah.
Hulk smash.
Exactly. Hulk smash.
pretty much rage.
Yeah. Gosh, that spin off into Star Trek Adventures now has me like thinking through other systems that I've played, just trying to think of other systems that have very specifically narrative mechanics. I mean, like other ones that I've played and I'm familiar with, because I know like I think it's Fate that has mechanics like that, but I don't know for sure. I don't know what they are. I've never played Fate, so I actually have no idea.
Yeah. I actually I'm trying to think about Weave. I've
mm,
only played Weave like the one time. Um
mm, yeah, I sort of feel like, and this is just sort of my initial impression. I'd have to think about it a lot more, but my guess is that Weave sort of falls in kind of a no place as far as this is concerned. It's not like really
mhm.
mechanical, but it's not exactly narrative either. I mean, it is narrative. A lot of the mechanics are narrative, but they're, I don't
Not in
know,
the
they're
same way
not
that
in the
it
same way. It doesn't make you be like think about, like you could play Weave just rolling and not thinking about your character at all. You could absolutely do that.
yeah, like the more that I'm recalling, because the only time that I've played Weave was almost exactly a year ago at Gen Con. So
On the floor of
um
of one of the hallways in
yeah,
the back of the building, just sort of like 11 of us just sitting around rolling dice. Yeah.
That was
yeah,
such a sweet moment.
passing around Caitlin's gigantic sword anytime somebody needed to feel particularly powerful
Yeah.
in a scene.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, but if I'm remembering correctly, a lot of the way that Weave works is it essentially kind of just provides mechanical bonuses that are explained narratively.
Mhm.
Um, and then those just kind of amount to like you're better at doing this kind of role than you are at this kind of role, and
Right.
so I think it kind of
It's
stops
basically,
there, which
yeah, it's like the because of this thing that you chose, you now get an extra die whenever you do this kind of roll.
mhm.
And that's
And it's
yeah.
flavored usually in a very like kind of funny quirky way because that's just like the mood of Weave from what I've gathered of people telling me about playing
Mhm.
it, but
Yeah, funny, quirky. Honestly, I think I would feel weird if I tried to play a serious game in Weave.
yeah,
It would feel really
which
weird.
it was nice playing. And actually I think that might be worth talking about in that the the it's not necessarily the mechanics of Weave, but like the way that they choose to flavor their mechanics does have an effect on the story that you tell,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So like the fact that my character is given like a cap gun and a mean streak, he just says kind of mean things when he gets really upset, like, you know, but not like really offensive stuff, just like kind of mean.
Yeah.
You know, it does kind of affect the kind of story that you tell when you're sitting down to play a Weave game, especially since, you know, you're talking about a bunch of teenagers. You're hardly going to sit down and tell like the prologue to It or something. God, I wish Caitlin were here for the Clown Town discussion, but
Yeah. Um Nico says it's really funny how a lot of today's conversation revolved around narrative decisions in combat because, and John knows this, I am currently theory crafting a setting agnostic RPG system that specifically focuses on narrative combat and teamwork. So this entire conversation is hugely interesting to me. That's good. I'm glad. I'm glad this is helpful. Um,
mhm.
yeah, that's really cool. First of all, and I'm very interested and curious. Uh, but yeah, that I think that is important, and I think it's in this conversation focusing around narrative decisions in combat is important because if we're talking about RPG systems, I think too often the idea of narrative and combat is discussed as two diametrically opposed things, and they don't have to be. Like they
Yeah,
don't have to be. In fact, I think they shouldn't be, because if you're gonna if depending on the system that you're playing, combat needs to carry weight, right? Like the weight of that decision. If you choose to fight rather than think your way out of a problem, or hide or run or whatever, that's a big deal, and it should feel
Mhm.
that way. You
Mhm.
know.
They
Yeah.
can't just be fighting for fighting's sake,
Exactly.
essentially.
Yeah. And that's what I mean about what I was saying earlier about D&D is exactly that, Freeman, that sometimes like it's entirely possible and honestly easier to play D&D without ever once thinking about your characters or their decisions and just fight. Is entirely possible to play D&D that way. You can do
Oh
that.
yeah. I mean, I
Battle
oh,
royales, essentially.
to use our Sunday game as a reference, like I threw a vampire in front of you guys that you very easily could have just like smashed. Like you could have done it, but because of the choices that I had made narratively about them, like it made it into a character choice. But
Exactly.
like the thing that D&D prepared you to do was to walk into that warehouse and kill the vampire, regardless of whether or not that vampire was trying to lift the curse of vampirism from all vampires
Mhm.
everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. Um Don't worry, Lucas. Once I have a functioning alpha build, I will 100% share over the Discord, however long that may take. Awesome. I'm
Very
excited.
interested in that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Absolutely. Um but yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to think of yeah, so the relationship between like combat and narrative, I think they can't be fully divorced ever. I think they shouldn't be in
Mm-hmm.
a TTRPG system. I mean, if combat isn't a part of the game that you're like, it's not going to be a part of everything. I mean, I think I'm thinking about like a genre like Kids on Bikes, right? A genre like playing kids in suburbia or whatever, like dealing with supernatural shit or weird shit in general. There doesn't have to be combat in that. Like you could very much
No.
and I think maybe that should be very combat light, to be honest, a genre
Mm-hmm.
like that. Um, I know Cypher in the Expanded Worlds book has rules and character options for like fairy tale setting. Like fairy tales are like there's combat in them, but it's more implicit than anything else. It's sort of and it's very background. It doesn't focus on that. The it's more often than not features people outsmarting their enemies or running away or tricking them into their own demise or something like that, right? Or falling to
Right.
their own demise themselves. Um, but so yeah, not to say that combat should be in every TTRPG, but I guess what I'm saying is that the conversation about combat and narrative shouldn't be two separate conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I think they, yeah.
Because like I know that I certainly enjoy like big produced TTRPG content like Critical Role, but I do kind of tune out when combat starts because I'm like, all right, this is gonna be an hour and a half to 2 hours
It's like,
of
okay, all right, they're gonna roll some d20s, maybe like cast a spell or two. Thing's gonna die, probably none of them. And okay, cool, we cool. All right, we cool.
if I glance over at the screen and I see that like half the cast is in tears and Laura Bailey's like, then like I'll turn the volume back on, but like, but like to find out
Mhm.
who's dead.
Yeah,
Yep.
But
yeah,
um, it's definitely like I they run a very narrative game, and so I tune into the parts of that game that are very narrative
hmm
focused, and then as soon as it turns to the thing that really that D&D is very good at, I'm like, and we're done
yeah.
watching.
Yes, Gemini Lightning, ask us a question. I want to hear your question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and while you were asking, I will just chime in and say, yeah, I feel the same way. The things like I go through cycles of like being caught up in Critical Role and then not being caught up. And when I catch up, it's usually because I became invested in some narrative part of the game, like character relationships or stuff like that. Anyway, um,
Mm-hmm.
when are we going to have a world building session where all we do is write Nurse What episode summaries?
You know, Lucas, we haven't
Don't,
decided.
in the words
We
of
haven't.
Gandalf the Grey, don't tempt me, Frodo. That's not necessarily not an option for one of our Reddits.
We haven't decided on the topic for this month.
Yeah, that's true. We haven't. Um, let's put it this way: it's not on the table. um, Techman says, "I've been attempting to look at combat through the lens of having meaning to the sides involved: predator versus prey, invader versus defenders, discussion of differing philosophies." Mm-hmm. Yes, that's good. That is important. I think that is huge. It kind of ties into a topic that I really don't want to get into on this episode because I don't think it's the most relevant. Although we were talking about alignments earlier, but I think it's sort of its own topic. But I will mention it in the context of what Techman just said, which is the conversation that has been going around recently. Our conversation, that's generous. Let's call it discourse, shall we? The discourse on evil aligned races, and those who push back against the idea of races being aligned, like totally separate from alignment. The people who push back on that, saying things like, "Well, how are you supposed to have conflict then?" And like, okay, listen.
Shitty people still exist.
Shitty people still exist, and that doesn't mean, and also doesn't mean that evil can't exist within the, like, doesn't mean you can't have evil orcs. It just means that orcs aren't evil by nature of them being orcs. Anyway, that's not a thing I want to rant about right now, although I could and have, but
mostly because we're out of time.
Mostly because we're out of time, but also because it's not entirely relevant to this topic. But this going along with what Techman brought up, I think that is, in discussing combat, I think it's so in TTRPGs, you also have, it can't, just like it can't be separate from the conversation about narrative, it also can't be separate from the discussion about reasons for the combat, right? Like, why is fighting happening? And generally speaking, in real life, like, fights happen when all other avenues have been of conflict resolution have been basically either attempted or totally removed from the equation. And so when you have a system that says, nope, fighting is plan A, if you end up not fighting, well, all right, but you're on thin ice, right? Like, that's that's essentially what that
when all you've got's a
conversation is.
hammer.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything looks like nails.
Exactly. Lucas and I are sharing a brain cell today. So that's who has it. That's who has it today. Yeah. So sorry, Freeman. You look like you were about to say something.
No, not at all.
Oh,
actually,
okay.
I was just taking a deep breath.
I see. It's important to do. It's important to just keep taking those. Like, don't stop doing that, because.
Yeah. Chat. Make sure that you unclench your jaw, take a deep breath, hydrate.
Yeah. I think that is all the time that we have tonight. Before we go, I know that we've sort of been we've been pretty light today, so but I do think it's important to say this, which is that, if you will allow me to get a little bit serious for a moment, and that is to say that right now things are really tough for a lot of people, for a lot of different reasons, and so it's more important now than ever that you reach out to your loved ones and make sure that they are okay. Make sure that you tell them that you love them and appreciate them. It's a good thing to do just in general, but especially now. So, yeah, that's just want to take a moment to say that, because I know that right now there's a lot of people out there who are hurting and in pain for various reasons, and it's important to reach out. So, all right. I love you too, Karaoke Night. And I appreciate you very much. And I appreciate all of you who are here with us. Those of you who are on VOD Squad, those of you who are lurking, those of you who are in the chat, those of you who don't really know what's going on and came here just because there was the talk shows and podcasts category on the browse page on Twitch. Welcome and hello. I'm sure we have at least one of those at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? So, I am going to, for the time being, issue our usual end of stream stuff, promotional stuff, but I will say that tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific, I remembered, probably, John, Bree, and I will be right here on this very channel playing some more Borderlands 2 and getting into all kinds of ridiculous, over-the-top shenanigans. And that's even aside from the stuff that's inherent in the Borderlands games. So, yes, Murderbot.
If you put me in the pilot seat in any game, in any multiplayer game ever, stuff's gonna happen.
It's very true. It's very true.
That's the best use of channel points that
Oh
I
my
have ever
gosh.
seen.
Yes. The most important takeaway from any of our streams ever is Murderbot fucks. All right. With that, everybody, have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning.
We should
whatever.
raid.
Yes, we should. I think for the
Who
sake
should
of
we
ease
raid?
right now, I was gonna say Saving Throw Show because Heart of Handprints gave me the idea because they went over there to see wild cards and they didn't get started that long ago. But let me just real quick make a quick check to see if there's anybody else.
Rachel Seeley and Vanna are both streaming right now. Patrick Rothfuss is streaming.
You know what? How about this? Let's go raid Grant Ellis. How's that?
Yeah.
Grant Ellis. He's
WebDM, right?
Yeah, he's a producer of WebDM and is well known throughout the TTRPG sphere. I'm not actually entirely sure what he's doing tonight. I believe he's playing a game, but so let's go do that. Let's go. Oh, hold on, I gotta actually see what his actual channel is called. I believe it's just there it is. Okay. All right, all. Let's get this. See if that's gonna go. Okay. Yes, we're getting ready to raid Grant. So everybody, take care of yourselves. And have a good night and good zone. We'll see you the next time you decide to come roll with us. Good night, everyone.
Good night.